The Srith warship hovered above the barren planet, its dark silhouette cutting through the stars like a shadow. Inside the cold, sterile cell, James sat on a small metal cot, his fingers tracing the rough edges of his uniform. His thoughts raced as the sound of distant footsteps echoed down the hallway. He had been captured during the last battle. His ship had been disabled, and the enemy had found him before he could escape. The Srith had been ruthless in their attacks on humanity, wiping out colonies, killing soldiers, and spreading fear. He had heard the stories, the horrors of what the alien race had done. But now, he was living them. A heavy metallic door slid open, and the Queen entered. Zara, the alien queen, stood before him, her presence commanding the room. Her body was tall, sleek, and armored, her skin a dark metallic gray that shimmered like polished stone. Her eyes, sharp and cold, studied James without emotion. He had heard the whispers about her, how she had conquered entire planets, how her people feared and worshipped her in equal measure. She was known for her ruthless decisions, for never showing weakness. And yet, here she was, standing in front of him, unyielding. She didn't speak at first, but instead walked around the cell, her boots clicking against the floor. James felt the weight of her gaze on him, as if she were measuring him, deciding whether he was worth anything. His heart raced, a mix of fear and curiosity filling him. What did she want with him? Why had she captured him and brought him here? Finally, Zara spoke, her voice deep and resonant, echoing in the small, dim room. "I have decided to let you go." James blinked in disbelief. "What?" Her gaze never left his.
"You heard me. You are free to leave."
James stood up slowly, his mind struggling to process her words. Free? After everything that had happened, she was letting him go? It made no sense. He had expected death, or at the very least, imprisonment.
But freedom?
"You're letting me leave?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Why?" The Queen remained silent for a moment, and James could almost hear the gears turning in her mind. When she spoke again, her words were carefully chosen. "Humanity has potential," she said. "I have seen it. I have witnessed it in the battles you fight, in the courage you show even when the odds are against you. You may not understand it, but I see something in you that others do not." James shook his head, still not believing what he was hearing.
"You want to use us?"
"Use me?" Zara's lips curled slightly. "I do not need to use you. I simply recognize strength when I see it. And I do not need you to remain here to prove that. You may leave. Go back to your home, Earth, if that is where you want to be. But do not forget the gift I have given you.
Do not forget the life I have spared."
She stepped aside, allowing him a clear view of the exit. It felt surreal, like some cruel trick. James was a soldier, a human in the middle of a galactic war. He had been taught to fear the Srith, to hate them for what they had done. And yet here he was, being given an opportunity he could never have imagined, the chance to leave, to go back home. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. But before he could speak again, the Queen spoke one last time. "Do not try to return here. If you do, I will not be so merciful." James nodded, still in shock, and slowly walked toward the exit. As he passed her, he couldn't help but feel the weight of her gaze following him, a silent promise hanging in the air. When he stepped outside, the fresh air hit him like a wave. The world outside was a vast expanse, unfamiliar and alien, but it felt like freedom. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way to the small ship she had provided him. It was a sleek silver vessel, its hull reflecting the starlight like a mirror. It seemed almost too small for the vast journey ahead of him, but it would have to do. The engines hummed to life as he climbed into the cockpit, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the controls. He set a course for Earth, the planet he had fought to protect, And as the ship lifted off the ground, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had been given his freedom, but it felt like there was something more beneath the surface. Sarah had let him go too easily, and he couldn't help but wonder why. What was her real motive? The journey back to Earth was long, and as James floated through space, his thoughts began to wander. He thought about the war, about the lives lost, and the destruction left in the wake of the Srith's conquest. But he also thought about the Queen, about the cold, calculating woman who had spared his life. He had seen something in her eyes, something that made him uneasy. Was she truly merciful? Or was she playing some long game, manipulating him in ways he couldn't understand? The days passed in a blur as he journeyed through the stars, the silence of space pressing in around him. He tried to push the thoughts aside, to focus on getting home, but they lingered. Why had Sarah really let him go? What was she planning? It wasn't until several days into the journey that something unexpected happened. His ship's sensors began to pick up an unfamiliar signal. At first, he thought it was a malfunction. But as he checked the coordinates, he realized it was coming from Srith space, the same place he had just escaped from. James felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew he should ignore it. He should keep his course and head straight for Earth, but curiosity got the better of him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him, something he needed to understand. He adjusted his course, bringing the ship closer to the signal. As he entered the atmosphere of the nearby planet, he marveled at how different it looked from the harsh, cold worlds of the Srith Empire. This was a paradise, a green and lush world full of life. It was peaceful, calm, and eerily beautiful. He landed the ship near the signal's source, stepping out into the vibrant landscape. The air was thick with the scent of flowers and fresh grass. It felt almost like a dream, a world untouched by war. James moved cautiously, scanning his surroundings. It was clear this place had been hidden away from the rest of the Srith Empire. But who would want to keep such a beautiful planet a secret? As he wandered through the forest, he heard something. A voice. At first he thought it was his imagination, but then he heard it again. It was faint, like the wind was carrying the sound. It was a child's voice, calling his name. James. He froze. The voice was unmistakable. He turned around, his heart leaping into his chest. A small figure emerged from the trees. A young girl, no older than 10, with bright, shimmering eyes. She was wearing a simple white garment, her hair flowing freely in the wind. She ran toward him, calling his name again. James. Confused, James took a step forward. How did this child know his name? How could she even be here, on this hidden world? The girl stopped in front of him, smiling up at him with innocence and wonder. You're James, right?
You're the one who helped my mother. James stared at her, speechless. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation.
This child. She had to be from the Srith. But why was she here? And why did she know his name? Before he could respond, the girl spoke again, her voice filled with emotion. Mama told me you would come for me. She said you would be the one to help us. And in that moment, everything clicked. This was no ordinary child. This was the Queen's daughter, the alien princess, the product of a forbidden union between Zara and a human. The Queen's secret, hidden away on this beautiful world, away from the chaos and war. James stood there, stunned. The alien queen had let him go. But it wasn't just for his freedom. It was because of her daughter. She had sent him here, unknowingly, to protect the girl who would bridge two worlds. As the young girl took his hand, looking up at him with a mix of hope and trust, James realized that his journey was far from over. This was just the beginning. James stood still in disbelief, as the young girl, no more than 10 years old, smiled up at him with a look of pure innocence. Her bright, shimmering eyes were filled with wonder, but they also held something else. A quiet knowing. She seemed to expect him, almost like he was a part of her story, though he had never seen her before. "You're James, right?" she asked again, as though repeating something she'd already said. "Mama told me you would come for me. She said you would help us." Her words sent a chill through him. The mention of her mother, the Srith Queen, struck him like a hammer. He had thought his escape was a final goodbye, that the Queen would not involve him any further. But here he was, standing on a peaceful world, far from the chaos of the Srith Empire, with a child who clearly knew who he was. James took a cautious step forward, kneeling down so he was closer to her level. His mind was racing, trying to process everything. This was no ordinary child. She couldn't be. The Queen, Sara, had never shown any signs of softness, yet here was her daughter, a girl who spoke with trust and confidence, as if she knew him intimately.
"Who are you?" James asked softly, his voice full of confusion. "How do you know my name?" The girl tilted her head, a small smile tugging at her lips.
Mama said you'd help. She said you'd come because you're like us, but different.
James felt his heart race. He could hear the words clearly, but the meaning was too much to understand. "Like us, but different?" he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. The girl nodded. "Yes."
You're not Srith. You're human.
But Mama told me you have something special. You're strong. You have courage. You have the same heart as her. And that means you'll protect me." James stood up, trying to wrap his head around the situation.
"You're the Queen's daughter," he said, his words feeling strange on his tongue.
"Why are you here?"
"What's going on?" The young girl's expression softened, a shadow passing over her face. "Mama didn't want me to stay in the palace. She said it wasn't safe. The others in the Empire, didn't like me. So we came here. We're hiding." James's mind raced. The Srith Empire was ruthless, led by a queen who was feared across the galaxy. The queen had been a conqueror, a symbol of power and fear. And yet here was her daughter, far away from the capital, on this peaceful, hidden world. But why? Why had she kept her daughter in hiding? And why had she sent him here? "You're hiding?" James asked, the word tasting strange in his mouth. "From your own people?" The girl nodded, her eyes downcast. "They don't like that I'm different. Mama said I'm special. She said I'm the bridge between the Srith and humans, but they don't see it that way." James felt a surge of compassion. He had known that the Srith were brutal, but this was different. The child's voice held no anger, only sadness. She was a victim of a war she didn't choose, a symbol of a conflict she couldn't escape.
"What do you mean, different?"
James asked, kneeling beside her again. He felt a need to understand, to know more. "What makes you different?" The girl's face brightened slightly, and she glanced up at James, her eyes sparkling with a childlike wonder. "Mama said it's because I have both blood. Srith and human. I'm not fully Srith."
"I'm not fully human either. I'm
something else." James' heart skipped a beat. The Queen, and her forbidden past, about the human prince she had once loved. But to hear it spoken by the Queen's own daughter, this was something entirely new. "So, you're the product of that union?" James asked carefully, though he already knew the answer. The girl nodded solemnly, her small fingers clenching and unclenching at her sides. "Mama said that's why they hate me. I'm not fully one of them, not fully part of their world." James was quiet for a moment, trying to absorb this new reality. The Srith Queen had a daughter with a human. The implications of that were far-reaching. He had no idea what kind of danger the girl was in, or what kind of challenges she would face in the future. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't walk away from her. She was as much a victim of the Empire as any human he had fought for.
I won't leave you, James said softly, the words coming naturally. I promise. I'll help you, and I'll protect you.
The girl smiled, her eyes lighting up at his words. Mama said you would. James gave her a gentle smile in return, but inside, his mind was spinning. The Srith Empire was vast, and they would stop at nothing to find their queen's daughter. If they knew she was here, they would come for her, no matter the cost. I need to take you to Earth, James said, his voice filled with resolve. We'll be safe there. I'll take you somewhere far from this place, where no one can find you. The girl shook her head slowly, her expression turning serious. Mama said we can't go back to Earth. It's too dangerous. The Srith will follow us. Well,
I'm not just a normal child. They'll know.
they'll come after me. James felt a chill run through him at the thought of the Empire coming after them. He didn't know how they would escape this. How could he protect her if the Srith were determined to find her? He had no answers. The situation was more complicated than anything he had faced in battle. Then what do we do? James asked, frustration creeping into his voice. How do we stay safe? The girl was quiet for a moment before looking up at James with a sad smile.
Mama said the only way to be safe is to hide, to never let them find us.
But she said you'd know what to do. You'll figure it out.
You always figure things out.
James exhaled sharply. He didn't feel like someone who could figure things out. He was just a soldier, someone who had been fighting a war for survival. But this was different. He was now responsible for a child who had no place in either world, no place in a universe that had torn itself apart with hatred. The girl reached up and gently touched James's hand. Her small fingers were cold, but they held a certain strength. She was braver than anyone he knew. She was a product of two worlds, two races that could never coexist. Yet here she was, trying to find her place in both. We'll figure this out, James said, more to himself than to her. He had to believe it. He had to. But deep down, he knew the truth. They were running. Running from the Empire, running from the Queen's own people. And the moment they left this place, there would be no turning back. The Srith would never let them go. James and the girl spent the next few days in the hidden world, moving through the dense forest and keeping out of sight. There was no sign of pursuit, no ships overhead or soldiers in sight, but James knew it was only a matter of time. The Srith would come eventually. They would follow the child. They would follow her, wherever she went, and when they did, he would be ready. The girl had told him about her mother's plans, about how she had been kept hidden away on this world, away from the Empire. But Zara, the Queen, had her reasons for doing so. She had always known that one day her daughter would have to face her destiny, and now it seemed that destiny had come calling. James sat in the small shelter they had built, staring at the stars through the canopy of trees above. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a protector, a guardian of someone far more important than he had ever imagined. And he wouldn't stop. He couldn't stop, no matter the cost. James had never imagined himself in a situation like this. In the past, his days had been filled with orders, combat strategies, and survival tactics. He had never been a protector, never had someone depend on him like this. And now, here he was, stuck on an alien world, with a child who carried the weight of two worlds on her small shoulders. He paced back and forth in the shelter, trying to think of their next move. They couldn't stay here much longer. The longer they remained in one place, the higher the chances of being found by the Srith. He couldn't allow that, not with her life at risk. But where could they go? Earth was too dangerous now, as the girl had said. The Srith Empire would never stop hunting her, and bringing her to Earth would be like leading an army straight to their doorstep. The girl, Lyra, was sitting in the corner of the shelter, drawing in the dirt with a stick. Her small face was focused, her brow furrowed as she worked, completely lost in her world. James couldn't help but admire her determination. She had been through so much already, and yet she still held on to the hope that things could be different. She still believed that there was a way out. "Lyra," James said, his voice gentle as he approached her. "We need to talk about what comes next." She looked up at him, her eyes bright and full of curiosity. "What do you mean?" James sat down next to her, trying to keep his tone calm.
We can't stay here forever. The Srith will find us eventually.
"We need to figure out where we can go. Somewhere safe." Lyra nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting the weight of the conversation.
I know. But Mama said we had to stay hidden. We can't let them find us. We can't go back to the Empire.
James sighed deeply. He had known this would be difficult, but hearing the words spoken out loud made it all the more real. They were trapped. The Srith Empire was vast, and no matter where they went, they would be hunted. But he couldn't let that stop them. He couldn't let her grow up hiding, always afraid. "What did your mother mean when she said you were the bridge?" James asked, trying to understand more about the girl's importance. "She said you were special." "What does that mean?" Lyra paused as if she was carefully considering how to answer.
I'm not fully Srith. I'm not fully human either. Mama says that's what makes me different. I have the strength of the Srith, but I also have the heart of a human.
She says, "That's why they don't understand me. They see me as weak because I'm not like them. But I can't be like them. I don't want to be." James listened carefully, taking in her words. He could see the conflict in her eyes. She was caught between two worlds, both of which rejected her. She wasn't Esrith enough to belong to the Empire, but she wasn't human enough to be accepted by his people either. She was an outcast, trapped between the two. "You're not weak," James said softly, his voice full of reassurance. "You're strong, Lyra. Stronger than most people I know." She looked up at him, her face softening a little at his words.
Do you really think so? James smiled and nodded. I know so.
The girl seemed to consider this for a moment before returning to her drawing, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. James sat in silence for a while, watching her. He had always been a soldier trained for battle, but now he found himself in a situation where his strength and training didn't seem to matter. There were no clear orders to follow, no enemy to defeat. There was only the weight of responsibility, the responsibility to protect this child, to ensure that she could grow up in a world that didn't see her as a weapon or a pawn. But how could he do that? He had no answers. All he had were questions, and none of them were easy.
We can't stay here,
James said after a while, standing up and moving toward the entrance of the shelter.
We need to keep moving. But I need to know more about your mother. Why would she send you away?
Why keep you hidden from the Empire? Lyra's face fell, her eyes clouding with sadness. Mama always said it wasn't safe for me to stay. She said they would never accept me.
I'm not like them, James. And they would never allow someone like me to live.
They would kill me if they knew where I was. James felt a pang in his chest as he listened to her words. It was clear that her mother, the Srith Queen, had made the decision to hide her away, not out of love, but out of necessity. She had seen what the Empire could do, what they were capable of, and she had known that her daughter would never be safe there. But she hadn't abandoned her daughter. She had sent her away to keep her safe, hoping that one day she would be able to return and claim her place in the world.
Do you want to go back to her?
James asked gently. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes wide and vulnerable.
I don't know. I don't want to go back to the Empire.
I don't want to be part of their world. But I miss her.
I miss her so much, James.
James's heart ached for the little girl. She had been through so much, and now she was forced to choose between two worlds that would never accept her. But he couldn't make the decision for her. He could only offer her the choice, the chance to create a future where she wasn't defined by the cruelty of the Srith Empire. James said, his voice full of determination.
We'll find a way to make sure you're safe. You deserve a chance to live without fear.
Lyra looked up at him, her expression softening. Thank you, James. I'm glad I'm not alone. James smiled, feeling a small sense of relief. He wasn't sure what the future held for them, but at least for now, they had each other, and that had to be enough. They spent the next few days in the shelter, staying hidden and out of sight. James knew they couldn't stay here forever, but for now, it was the safest place they had. The more he learned about Lyra, the more he understood the weight of the situation. She was not just a child. She was the key to something much bigger. Her existence represented the possibility of peace between two worlds that had been at war for far too long. If the Srith ever found out who she truly was, they would stop at nothing to destroy her. But if humanity discovered her, if they knew the truth, it could change everything. The two races could finally come together, and the endless war could end. But that was a dream, one that seemed impossible. The reality was much harsher. They had to survive first. They had to get out of here before the Empire came for them. And James had to protect her, no matter what. It was early in the morning when the first sign of trouble came. The air around them seemed to shift, the peaceful quiet of the forest replaced by a low, rumbling sound in the distance. James immediately stood up, his instincts kicking in. The sound grew louder, and the ground beneath him vibrated with the force of it. He turned to Lyra, who was still sitting on the floor, her face pale with fear. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tense. "They're coming," Lyra whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "They've found us." James's heart sank. He knew it was only a matter of time before the Srith found them, but he hadn't expected it to happen so soon. They had to move. Now he grabbed Lyra's hand and pulled her toward the exit. "We need to go, now," he urged, his voice firm. As they ran into the dense forest, James could hear the sound of engines in the distance. The Srith had arrived, and they were not going to stop until they had what they wanted. The ground shook beneath their feet as James pulled Lyra through the dense forest. The engines of the Srith ships roared in the distance, their noise growing louder with each passing second. James' heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline rushing through his veins as he scanned the trees around them, trying to stay one step ahead of their pursuers. "Keep moving, Lyra," he urged, his voice tight with urgency. He could hear the faint sound of boots crunching against the forest floor behind them. The Srith soldiers were close. Lyra stumbled slightly as she tried to keep up, her small hand still gripping James's tightly. She was trembling, but there was determination in her eyes. She had always known this day would come, but that didn't make it any easier to face. "We have to find somewhere to hide," James muttered to himself. He was scanning the area, looking for any possible place where they could take cover. His military training kicked in, and he instinctively knew that running wasn't going to be enough. They needed a plan. They came to a clearing, the trees parting to reveal a small ravine ahead. It was the perfect spot, a natural barrier that would block them from sight. James pulled Lyra toward the ravine, his mind racing. They couldn't afford to be seen. If the Srith found them now, it would be over. He pushed her ahead of him, urging her to keep going. "Down here!" Quickly, James ordered, his voice low but filled with urgency. Lyra obeyed without question, her small feet moving faster as they descended into the ravine. The ground was uneven and the rocks were slippery, but they had no choice but to keep going. They reached the bottom of the ravine, where the shadows were thick and the trees grew tall, providing them with some cover. James crouched down next to a large rock, pulling Lyra close to him. He could feel her trembling, but he couldn't afford to show fear. Not now. Not when their lives were at stake. He listened carefully, straining to hear any movement from above. The sounds of the Srith soldiers grew louder, closer. They were almost upon them. James' pulse quickened. He had to think fast. "We can't stay here long," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We need to move again. They'll search this ravine soon." Lyra nodded silently, her face pale and filled with fear. James could see how terrified she was, but he also saw the trust in her eyes. She was relying on him to get them out of this. He couldn't let her down. He took a deep breath and stood up, keeping low to the ground. "Come on, Lyra," he said, his voice steady. "We need to keep moving." They moved through the ravine, carefully navigating the rocks and trees, doing their best to stay quiet. The forest was still and eerily silent now, as if holding its breath. James kept one hand on Lyra's shoulder, guiding her through the underbrush. Every time a twig snapped underfoot, he tensed, his eyes darting around to make sure they weren't being followed. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the far side of the ravine, where the trees began to thin out. James paused for a moment, taking in their surroundings. There was a small rise in the distance, a hill that overlooked the entire area. It could be their ticket to escape, a place where they could assess the situation and make a plan.
Up there, James said, pointing to the hill. We need to get higher.
"We'll have a better view from the top." Lyra nodded, and they started making their way up the incline. The climb was steep, but they didn't have time to waste. James's mind was racing, thinking of all the possible outcomes, each one worse than the last. If they didn't get away now, if they didn't find a way to disappear, the Srith would find them, and when they did, they wouldn't be kind. As they reached the top of the hill, James scanned the area, trying to find a way out of this. The Srith ships were circling above, their engines low as they searched the forest below. James could see the soldiers moving through the trees, their armor glinting in the sunlight. He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of their situation bearing down on him. They were running out of time. He grabbed Lyra's hand again, pulling her behind a large boulder at the top of the hill. They crouched down, breathing heavily. James's mind raced, but all he could think about was one thing. They had to get out of here. From the top of the hill, James could see the Srith ships in the distance, moving in tight formations. They were methodical, searching every inch of the forest. He could see their tactics, how they were scouring the area, moving slowly but deliberately. They weren't in a rush. They were confident that they would find them. James cursed under his breath. He had no idea how they were going to get past them. No matter which direction they went, they would be seen. The Srith had them surrounded. "We need a distraction," James muttered to himself, his mind racing. He needed something to throw them off, something to make the Srith believe they were somewhere else. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes wide. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her voice full of fear. She had never been in a situation like this before. She had no idea what the Srith were capable of, how ruthless they could be. But James did, and he was determined to protect her. James looked around the hilltop, his eyes darting from one point to another. His gaze landed on a small ridge that ran parallel to where they were hiding. If he could get to that ridge, he might be able to create a diversion. It was risky, but it was their only chance. "We're going to make a run for it," James said quietly, his voice steady. "I need you to trust me, Lyra."
When I say go, we're going to move fast. Lyra nodded, her face pale but determined.
She didn't hesitate. She was learning quickly, adapting to the danger that surrounded them. James was proud of her, proud of how she was handling everything. She was more resilient than he had ever imagined. He checked the area one last time, making sure the Srith were focused on their search. He could see a group of soldiers moving toward their position, but they were still a distance away. He had to act fast. "Now!" James said, and they both sprang to their feet, darting toward the ridge. They moved quickly, their feet barely making a sound on the soft earth. James kept his eyes on the soldiers, watching as they got closer. He knew they couldn't stay hidden for much longer. They had to get to the ridge where they could create the diversion and throw the Srith off their trail. The soldiers were only a few yards away now, but they hadn't seen them yet. James pushed himself harder, urging Lyra to keep up. They were almost there, just a few more steps, and then they would have a chance to escape. James reached the ridge first and turned back to look at Lyra. She was only a few steps behind him, but her face was filled with fear. He held his hand out to her, and she took it, her small fingers wrapping around his tightly. Together, they scrambled to the top of the ridge, and James quickly scanned the area for anything they could use. He spotted a large rock at the edge of the ridge, and without hesitation he ran toward it. He grabbed the rock and dragged it to the edge of the hill. With a swift push, he sent it tumbling down the slope, making a loud noise as it crashed into the trees below. The soldiers immediately turned their attention to the noise, and James and Lyra took that moment to sprint down the opposite side of the ridge. They didn't stop, didn't look back. They ran as fast as they could, pushing themselves harder than they ever had before. Behind them, the Srith soldiers were shouting, rushing toward the noise. James could hear their voices getting louder as they closed in, but he kept moving, his heart racing. They had to get as far as possible before the Srith realized they had been tricked. They ran for what felt like hours, through the thick forest, over uneven terrain, with no plan other than to keep moving. They couldn't stop. They couldn't look back. Every step was one closer to freedom, one closer to safety. Finally, as the sun began to set, they found themselves at the edge of the forest. They could see the outline of a small settlement in the distance, a group of buildings nestled in the valley below. It wasn't much, but it was a place to rest, to regroup, and to figure out their next move. James stopped, breathing heavily. He turned to Lyra, who was equally out of breath, but still determined. "We made it," he said, a smile breaking through his exhaustion. "We're safe for now." Lyra looked up at him, her eyes shining with a mix of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I knew you could do it. You really are strong, James." James smiled and squeezed her hand. "We both are," he said quietly. "We're in this together." And with that, they began to walk toward the settlement, knowing that their journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, James felt a flicker of hope. They had survived, and that meant